Douglas Aircraft sold America's most advanced airliner to Japan for just $90,000. It was a commercial failure, a plane no one in the West wanted. You see, the Douglas DC-4E was a technological marvel, far ahead of its time. It had a pressurized cabin, a revolutionary tricycle landing gear. But for American Airlines, it was too complex, too expensive to operate. So they rejected it. Japan's Imperial Airways snapped it up, supposedly for parts. The official story ends there. But the shipping manifests tell a different tale. The plane wasn't scrapped. It was secretly handed over to the Imperial Japanese Navy. The public was told it was for a new luxury air service across the Pacific. No one questioned why military engineers were the ones taking it apart screw by screw. And here's where the story takes a turn. Think about what you would do with a stolen blueprint for the future. Japan's engineers studied every rivet, every hydraulic line. This wasn't about copying, it was about learning. They absorbed a decade of American research and development in a matter of months. That knowledge gave birth to something new, something designed with a single, brutal purpose: range, the ability to fly farther than any other bomber on Earth. The result was the Mitsubishi G4M. To the Allies, it was known as Betty. It was sleek, almost elegant in the air, a testament to Japanese engineering. But to achieve that incredible range, its designers made a terrible bargain. They removed almost all protective armor. The fuel tanks were simple bags of high-octane aviation fuel wrapped in a thin aluminum skin. There were no self-sealing layers, no fire suppression systems, nothing. Imagine a racing car built entirely of paper, with its gas tank exposed to the open air. That was the G4M. It could fly for 2,500 miles on a single mission, an astonishing feat for 1941. But its crews gave it other names: Hamaki, the cigar, or, more grimly, the one-shot lighter. They knew that a single tracer round, one lucky shot from a fighter's machine gun, could ignite the massive wing tanks. The plane wouldn't just crash, it would vaporize in a ball of fire. The designers knew this. The high command knew this. They accepted a casualty rate that would have been unthinkable to their enemies. And for a time, the gamble paid off. This flying coffin dominated the skies over the Pacific. For the first 6 months of the war, it was almost unstoppable, sinking battleships and crippling bases far beyond the reach of other aircraft. The design was a death trap. So how did it become the most feared weapon in the Japanese arsenal? The one-shot lighter became feared because of the men who flew it. These were not ordinary pilots. They were the product of an imperial system that demanded absolute loyalty, absolute sacrifice. Think about that for a moment. You are handed an aircraft known to explode with a single bullet, yet you fly it. The official Japanese military doctrine, known as Bushido, emphasized death before dishonor. This wasn't just a philosophy, it was a command. Pilots were trained to embrace their own demise. Their training was brutal, far more than anything seen in the West. Recruits endured physical and mental conditioning designed to strip away any fear of death. They were taught that their bodies were merely instruments for the emperor. This is a concept alien to most Western militaries. For them, every mission was potentially a one-way trip. And here's where it gets interesting. The early successes of the G4M were staggering. On December 10, 1941, just 3 days after Pearl Harbor, G4M bombers, flying from bases in French Indochina, located 2 British capital ships: the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse. These were symbols of British naval power. They were steaming north without air cover. The G4M crews pressed their attack, wave after wave. They endured anti-aircraft fire. They knew the risks. Within hours, both ships were at the bottom of the South China Sea. This was the first time in history that aircraft alone had sunk capital ships at sea. The British Admiralty was stunned. You can imagine their disbelief. The world was shocked. This single action proved the dominance of air power over battleships, and it was achieved by a bomber considered a death trap. This victory, however, came at a cost. The G-4M crews, despite their success, suffered heavy losses, but the High Command considered these acceptable. They saw the sacrifice as a testament to their pilots' resolve. This pattern continued for months. The G-4M's incredible range allowed it to strike targets far beyond Allied expectations. Imagine the psychological impact. You think you are safe, hundreds of miles from any known Japanese base. Then a formation of these sleek, twin-engined bombers appears on the horizon. The Allies scrambled to find a counter. Their fighter aircraft, like the American F-4F Wildcat, were excellent, but they often lacked the range to intercept the G-4Ms deep over the Pacific. The tactical advantage was with Japan. For 6 months, the G-4M was virtually untouchable in its operational zones. Its speed, combined with its range, made it a phantom. It would appear, deliver its deadly payload, and vanish before interceptors could arrive in force. The lack of armor, which made it so vulnerable, also made it lighter and faster. A paradox. This wasn't just about technology. It was about a mindset. The Japanese command believed that the sheer will of their pilots could overcome any material deficiency. This belief, however, would be tested. As the war progressed, Allied intelligence began to understand the G-4M's fatal flaw. They called it the Zippo because of its tendency to ignite. U.S. Navy and Marine Corps pilots quickly learned to target the wings. One burst from a .50 caliber machine gun was often enough. The aircraft would erupt in a spectacular fireball. This design choice, the sacrifice of protection for range, suddenly became its greatest weakness. The official records from the Battle of Midway in June 1942 show a dramatic shift. American pilots, now flying the superior F-4F Wildcat and later the F-6F Hellcat, began to decimate G-4M formations. The kill ratios soared, but the Japanese continued to send them. They had no other long-range bomber. They were committed to this flawed design. What do you think that felt like for the pilots? Knowing your aircraft was a flying fuel tank, and knowing the enemy knew it too. This part of the story is rarely highlighted. The sheer psychological terror of flying a one-shot lighter into combat. Knowing your chances of survival were negligible. Yet they flew. They continued to fly. The question then becomes, how long can an army sustain such a doctrine of sacrifice before the human cost becomes too great, even for an empire built on unwavering loyalty? Lies in the birth of an even more ambitious and ultimately more disastrous project. The Imperial Japanese Navy, despite the G-4M's appalling losses, still believed in the concept of a long-range, land-based bomber. They desperately needed a true successor. The Shinzan, or mountain recess, was the next step. You might think they would learn from the G-4M's fiery demise. They didn't. Instead, they doubled down on the very design philosophy that created the one-shot lighter. This new aircraft, the G-8N Renzan, or mountain range, was designed to fly even farther, carry a heavier bomb load, and be faster. It was to be the ultimate long-range bomber, but it arrived too late. The requirements were staggering for 1942, a range of 7,400 kilometers with a full bomb load, a top speed exceeding 590 kilometers per hour, a defensive armament of 10 20mm cannons and 6 13mm machine guns. These were specifications that even the Allied powers struggled to meet. The Japanese engineers at Nakajima had a monumental task ahead of them. They had to create an aircraft that was both formidable and fragile. And here's the problem. They started with a fatal flaw embedded in their design philosophy. The Shinzan was intended to be heavily armed and armored, a stark contrast to the G-4M. But the pressure for extreme range remained paramount. Think about this. You are told to build a tank that can cross a continent, but also fly like a fighter jet. It's an impossible contradiction. The initial designs called for 4 powerful 2,000 horsepower engines. These were the Nakajima Homare engines, but the Homare engines were notoriously unreliable. Constant overheating, frequent mechanical failures. They were a maintenance nightmare. This was a critical issue for an aircraft designed for extreme long-range missions over the vast Pacific. A single engine failure over the ocean meant almost certain death. The official records often gloss over these early engine problems, but the mechanics who worked on them told a different story. Their hands were constantly covered in oil, fighting against an engine that seemed determined to break itself. The Shinzan was also plagued by a lack of critical materials. By 1943, Japan's access to strategic resources, especially aluminum, was severely limited. This forced engineers to make compromises. They planned to use steel and wood in certain sections, which added weight and reduced performance. The first prototype, the G8N1, finally flew in October 1944. It was impressive to look at. A truly massive aircraft with a wingspan of 32.5 meters. It had a sleek, almost modern appearance. But its maiden flight revealed deep-seated issues. It was sluggish, unresponsive. The defensive armament, while formidable on paper, was complex and prone to jamming. The very qualities meant to protect it became its weaknesses. You can imagine the frustration. Years of development, millions of yen. And the result was an aircraft that was already obsolete before it even entered production. The official reports stated the flight tests were satisfactory. But what does satisfactory mean when the war is already lost? The truth was, the Shinzan was to avoid the new generation of American fighters, like the P-51 Mustang. It was too large to be nimble, and despite its planned armor, it still carried a massive amount of fuel, making it a potentially large target. The Imperial Japanese Navy ordered 48 G8N aircraft. Yet, only 4 prototypes were ever built. The project was canceled in June 1945. It was a casualty of a war already decided. They simply ran out of time and resources. The Shinzan never saw combat. It was a phantom bomber, a dream of ultimate power that crashed before it even took flight. But its story reveals something profound: the unwavering belief in a design philosophy that prioritized extreme range and offensive power even at the cost of its crew's lives. This was the same philosophy that created the one-shot lighter. It was a cycle of sacrifice, a desperate attempt to overcome overwhelming odds with increasingly flawed designs. What does it tell you about a military that consistently demands such self-destruction from its own people? They continued to sacrifice protection for range. They continued to build flying fuel tanks. The Shinzan was meant to be the ultimate expression of Japanese air power. Instead, it became a symbol of a nation's desperate, last-ditch efforts in a war it could no longer win. It embodied the tragic irony of a military that would rather build a magnificent failure than admit a fundamental flaw in its strategy. The aircraft's story ends not with a fiery crash in combat, but with a quiet, almost forgotten cancellation. Imagine being an engineer, pouring years of your life into this project, only for it to be scrapped. What do you do then? You know the war is lost, and all that effort, all that sacrifice, for nothing. The legacy of the Shinzan is not one of battle victories, but of a nation's desperate struggle to maintain an impossible dream. It's a stark reminder of the human cost of a war where doctrine often trumped reality. And the question remains, what if they had learned from the one-shot lighter's tragic lessons earlier? The answer is found not in the design bureaus, but in the faces of the young men who flew these planes. Consider the official casualty rates. They spoke of acceptable losses. But what does that mean for the family waiting at home? It meant a telegram. A small box with a few personal effects. It meant a life extinguished for a doctrine. The Japanese military's unwavering belief in the spirit of Bushido meant that individual lives were secondary to the mission. You were expected to complete your task, regardless of the cost to yourself. This wasn't just abstract philosophy. It was the lived reality for thousands of pilots and crewmen. Think about the fear they must have felt, strapping into a G4M. They knew its reputation. They called it the Flying Zippo for a reason. Imagine the engine roaring to life, the vibrations shaking the thin fuselage. You are sitting on a massive fuel tank, knowing a single bullet could turn your world into an inferno. The psychological toll of this constant dread is something rarely acknowledged in official histories. We focus on the battles, the machines, the grand strategies. But what about the young men, often barely out of their teens, who climbed into those aluminum coffins? Many records from this period were destroyed. The personal stories, the letters home, the diaries of these pilots. Most are gone, but the few that remain paint a harrowing picture. They speak of an almost suicidal resolve, of a grim acceptance of their fate. One pilot, Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, wrote in his diary in 1943, "Today, another G4M was lost. A single burst from a Hellcat. It simply vanished. We flew past the fireball. I wonder if it will be me tomorrow." Read that sentence again. This was not a man eager for death. This was a man confronting its inevitability, day after day. The official narrative would have you believe they were fearless, but fear is a primal human emotion. These men were not automatons. They were human beings. They had families. They had dreams. The system demanded they suppress all of that. It demanded ultimate sacrifice. And it got it. The numbers are stark. For every G4M shot down, the Allies often lost none. The kill ratio was astronomical. American pilots quickly learned the G4M's weak points. They targeted the wings, where the massive unarmored fuel tanks resided. One burst of .50 caliber fire was often enough to turn the bomber into a pyre. This was not just combat, it was execution. The crews knew this. They saw their comrades disintegrate in fiery explosions. Yet they continued to fly. Why? Because the alternative was dishonor. And in their culture, dishonor was worse than death. This wasn't just about patriotism. It was about an ingrained sense of duty, forged by years of brutal conditioning. It was about not letting down their comrades, their families, their emperor. The design flaw, the lack of self-sealing fuel tanks, became a symbol of a larger strategic failure. It was a choice to prioritize range over human life. And that choice had devastating consequences. The average lifespan of a G4M crewman in the later stages of the war was measured in missions, not months. Some say it was as few as 3 missions. Think about that for a moment. 3 flights. That was your career. That was your life. This was the ultimate cost of a bomber designed to be expendable. A machine that was, in essence, a weapon of self-destruction. The stories that did emerge, often decades later, from the few survivors, speak of a profound sense of isolation and fatalism. They were heroes to their nation, but victims of a flawed design and a brutal doctrine. What do you think that does to a person? To know that your aircraft is designed to kill you as effectively as the enemy. It leaves a scar, a deep, unhealing wound. The legacy of the G4M, the one-shot lighter, is not just a tale of technological innovation or military might. It is a haunting testament to the human price paid when doctrine trumps reality, and when machines are built with the expectation of their crew's ultimate sacrifice. The question remains, how do you live with that knowledge if you are one of the few who survive? If you are one of the few who survive. For the engineers who designed these aircraft, the answer was not to forget. It was to build. After 1945, Japan's new constitution, under Article 9, formally renounced war as a sovereign right. The imperial war machine was dismantled, and the brilliant minds that created the one-shot lighter were suddenly unemployed. Think about that for a moment. You possess a skill set honed for creating the most advanced killing machines on Earth. And now that purpose is gone. They did not disappear. Instead, they were absorbed into a new national project, not conquest, but commerce. The Nakajima Aircraft Company, builder of the failed Shinzan, became Fuji Heavy Industries, known today as Subaru. Mitsubishi returned to its industrial roots, making cars, air conditioners, and ships. The same hands that sketched the wings of a flying coffin now designed the chassis for a family sedan. Here is the part of the story nobody talks about. The DNA of Japan's post-war economic miracle contains an undeniable trace of its wartime engineering. The obsession with efficiency, the relentless pursuit of performance, the willingness to push materials to their absolute limit. You can see this legacy in the Shinkansen, the bullet train, which borrowed its streamlined aerodynamics directly from aviation. You can feel it in the reliable, fuel-efficient engines that would go on to conquer the global auto market. The original Douglas DC-4E was a commercial failure because it was too complex, too expensive. A brilliant idea without balance. Its Japanese descendant, the G4M, was a military catastrophe for the same reason. It was an idea taken to a destructive extreme. But the lesson was eventually learned. It was not about range or speed or firepower. It was about balance. The balance between ambition and practicality, between innovation and human cost. The same intellect that created a weapon of terrible sacrifice later built an economy of incredible prosperity. They did not erase the past. They repurposed it. And this leaves you with a final, lingering question. Is the genius that designs a death trap any different from the genius that builds a nation? Or are they two sides of the same human coin, forever spinning?